As COVID-19 spread across the world, we've watched as nations have done all they can to bring it under control, albeit with varying degrees of success. South Korea and Singapore seem to get on top of it pretty quickly. But then others like the US and the UK have struggled with soaring infection rates and devastating death tolls. So why is that? Well, our next guest thinks it could be down to cultural factors. Michelle Gelfand is a professor of psychology at the University of Maryland and author of Rule Makers, Rule Breakers: How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. Great to have you on the program, Michelle. A lot of people look at it sort of on the surface and think, well, when you mean tight and when you mean loose, it means authoritarian and it means democratic. Okay, sure. China can keep things under control because they're authoritarian. The United States is a bit messier because it's a free country. Tell me why that's probably a misrepresentation of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that the key here is to think beyond just governance, but to think about social norms. So in our work, we differentiate cultures that are tight, that are rule-abiding, and are prioritize order over freedom, versus loose cultures that are much more permissive, and they are people who have more difficulty following social rules. And this actually has a lot to do with nations' histories. We find that in our work that cultures that have a lot of chronic threat throughout their histories, whether it's from famine or whether it's from disease or invasions, tend to veer tight. These are places like Singapore and Germany and Austria and Japan. Other cultures that had less threat, whether it's invasions or famine or population density, tend to veer loose. They're more permissive. And the key in our data that's now under peer review is that the countries that are doing the best are not autocratic, but they have governments that are very efficient, that are able to swiftly coordinate the private and public sector. And they also have people who are following norms that are tight. And those two factors in combination seem to be key in terms of flattening the curves and reducing death rates.
So where you are in the United States, those people who go out onto the streets, sometimes with their guns, without masks, sometimes we've seen videos of people, spitting at cashiers and people at the checkout counter of supermarkets saying, "This is my freedom, you can't control me." Tell me why they have this notion that by being told to follow the rules, their freedom's being taken away from them.
Yeah, well, it's a very complicated, messy, uncoordinated mess here in the United States. Part of that is our cultural programming. As I mentioned, cultures that haven't had a lot of chronic threat in their histories have prioritized freedom over constraint because they have the luxury of doing so. The United States has not been invaded by Mexico and Canada over its history. We've had our sense of conflict, but not chronically. And so people aren't used to tightening up under threat. And what's happening in the United States is that we're getting also very conflicted signals from the government in contexts where your own president and related officers are not wearing face masks or are actually really not taking the threat particularly seriously. That sends strong signals to people that it's okay to not tighten up. And it's what I call an evolutionary mismatch. In times of threat, people tend to actually tighten up. It's evolutionarily adaptive. We need strict rules and coordinated governments to coordinate to survive in these kinds of contexts. And to the point of the last guest, it's not that we have to tighten up forever. We need to tighten up when threat is real. And as I mentioned, This is really something that's evolutionary adaptive.
Right. So as you say, tightening up, that also implies, well, loosening up when it necessitates it, right? So this is it seems to be a dynamic process, right? So tell me, with that in mind, give me examples of places where they can sort of do that vacillating, the tightening and the loosening in the correct way when required.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the issue, is what I call a tight, loose dance is what we're going to be really experiencing over the next year to 16 months. The idea that threat has to be calibrated, the rule abided should be calibrated to the amount of threat. So we need really clear signaling in our communities of when we have rising cases, when our hospital capacity is being threatened, so that we can quickly tighten up. And again, that's temporary. Once we know that it's safer to go out, we could start to loosen again. I think what's critical is that people have different mindsets regarding tight and loose. On my website at michellegelfand.com, you could take the tight loose mindset quiz and see where you fall on this tight loose continuum. Some people prefer rules and order. Other people are more loose. They're more risk seeking. And we have to manage conflicts over this distinction. For people that are veering loose, they really want to get out earlier. And they need to do that, again, calibrated based on the amount of threat. People who are tight take longer to loosen up, and they might need to take more baby steps in feeling safe.
Does a lot of it also have to do with the lack of trust in institutions and governments? So if you're used to living under a government where they said, oh, there's a threat of terrorism, in order to fight the terrorists, we need to take all your rights away temporarily and we'll give them back to you, and they never came back. So you're not going to do the same when you feel as if you've been burnt once. You're not going to be burnt twice, and you're not going to give the government this power over you, even if there's a pandemic.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I think, though, that in times of threat, people tend to really desire autocratic leaders, and they want strict rules because, again, feeling a sense of uncertainty makes people really want order. It's a primal sort of social feeling that I think comes from our evolutionary past. The problem with autocratic leaders is that when they start taking over power and stop coordinating really to help fight the disease, that's where countries get into trouble. And so it's really not about autocratic governments that are really helping us. It's about governments that are really efficient. To your point about South Korea and Hong Kong, they're really able to swiftly coordinate, and they have people that are following social norms.
So towards the end of May now, we are, for most countries, at the point of the loosening part of the dance. How do you assess it right now across the world?
I think we see varying degrees of success of that. I think in the United States, we see a really big mismatch in contexts that still have a lot of cases where people are prioritizing the economy rather than prioritizing life or death decisions. We have a tremendous amount of confusion around the amount of cases, and we look to our role models, our community leaders, our president, particularly people in tighter states in the United States that tend to be more conservative, are looking to Trump to tell them what to do. And they're loosening up, in my opinion, too quickly. And I think that this will have a really important, long-standing effect on what's happening in these states. They'll take longer to tighten up, but I think they will once they see that this is affecting their friends, their families, from loosening up too quickly.
Okay. Michelle Gelfand, really good to talk to you. Some interesting insights in how culture affects the different responses to COVID-19.